Hi everyone. Today I want to give you some recommendations for books to read about capitalism and neoliberalism and disasters. This is a pretty specific topic, so I assume that if you're watching this video, you already kind of have a sense of what I'm talking about. But just to give you a little bit of background, Naomi Klein wrote this book called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. This book is about more than just natural disasters. It's about crisis in general and how capitalism both creates and feeds off of crisis. She uses this term disaster capitalism, which others have built upon. Companies and corporations have learned how to exploit communities that have experienced disasters. People are kind of disoriented about what's happening when there's no plan in place for recovery. Outside companies and corporations and politicians can use this time period for their own personal benefits, whether that means being able to build up the tourism industry following the Indian Ocean tsunami, or if it means privatizing the school system in New Orleans after Katrina, to implement things that aren't necessarily beneficial to the local communities or aren't necessarily what the survivors of that disaster want for their community. Basically, this concept of disaster capitalism is the origins of that are found in this book, which I definitely highly recommend reading if you're interested in this concept. But there are a few other books that address this issue. The first one is called The Neoliberal Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, Late Capitalism, and the Remaking of New Orleans by Cedric Johnson. Well, it's an edited volume by Cedric Johnson. I will warn you when books tend to be more on the academic side, and this book is a bit more academic. If you're interested in this subject, I think you're probably fine reading this. I think you are interested enough to dig into a book like this. Essentially, this is all about disaster capitalism in New Orleans after Katrina. This book talks about how neoliberal policies led to Katrina and also how neoliberal policies have reshaped New Orleans. There's a few things going on in this book. So one major thing that they're getting at here is that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. How disasters, by their very definition, are rooted in the interaction between a hazard, in this case a hurricane, and the failure of the flood control system in New Orleans interacted with the people who lived in New Orleans and the city itself. They're talking about the policies that led to certain demographics of people living in certain areas and the transportation system in New Orleans being the way that it was. And then they're also talking about how neoliberal policies have come in post-Katrina to reshape things. An obvious example was privatizing the New Orleans school system after Katrina. That was a plan that many people were trying to do before Katrina, and because of community pressure, they hadn't been able to implement that plan once Katrina happened, with everything in such disarray and resources not available to the public school system. They were able to come and very quickly put that plan in place. So this is a book to check out if you're interested in neoliberalism, specifically about Katrina. This next book I have is called Capitalizing on Catastrophe, Neoliberal Strategies in Disaster Reconstruction, edited by Nandini Gunawardena. I always said that right. And Mark Schuler. This book is about how we're seeing emergency management become increasingly privatized and what some of the implications of that are. Privatization in emergency management is a little bit inevitable, as they point out. It's coming on the heels of privatization of the US military and also starting to privatize are continuing to privatize the humanitarian aid sector, refugee aid. Disasters are right along these same lines. If we start privatizing aspects of the emergency management system that have traditionally been the responsibility of government and nonprofits, what will that do? How will we make sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable? Who is actually picking up the tab for this? Who's making a profit off of disasters? This book really starts to interrogate some of those really big questions that we don't have a lot of clear answers on, and in my opinion, the answers that we do have are not great. So this book is probably what people would consider more academic. I have to be kind of into this topic to pick this one up. The next book I have is called Markets of Sorrow, Labors of Faith, New Orleans in the Wake of Katrina by Vincanne Adams. I think that's how you say it. So this book is an ethnographic account of long-term recovery in New Orleans. Adams examines how social services in New Orleans were turned over to private companies, and also discusses how some of the aid that was provided was done so through privatized grants. Adams also talks about how there were companies who simultaneously made a lot of money during the recovery and also didn't really do a lot to help anybody. In addition to the chatter about neoliberalism, there's at least a whole chapter in here, I think multiple chapters though, if I remember correctly, about grassroots organizing in New Orleans post-Katrina. This is also a more academic book, though it is less academic-y than the last two I recommended. It does tell a bit more of a story, so this may be kind of a good starter book if you're interested in this but aren't looking to dive too deep into statistics and whatnot. I do just want to point out really quickly that Katrina is on the high end of major disasters. Usually we don't see this type of privatization to the extent that is talked about in this book and the other New Orleans book. We don't see that after like a normal small disaster. We tend to see that this is happening more when we have catastrophic events like Katrina. So just kind of keep that in mind if you don't have a disaster background and you're reading this. Just kind of maybe keep that in mind as you're reading. The last book I have is called Disaster Capitalism: Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe by Anthony Lowenstein. This book takes a look at how disaster capitalism has recently affected different countries. Let me see. So he talks about Afghanistan, Pakistan, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, the US, Britain, Greece, and Australia. So the thing I really like about this book is that it does take an international perspective. It shows that this isn't just happening in the United States. This isn't just something that was unique to Katrina. This is an international issue. The other thing I like about this book specifically is that he examines disaster capitalism in the context of refugees. I think that's really useful because it helps show how disaster capitalism isn't necessarily something that's unique to natural disasters or sudden onset human-made disasters, but that this is something that we've seen happen more widely. If you don't have an academic background and you're not too sure about disaster capitalism, don't know much about neoliberalism, this is probably the book that I would recommend starting with. I think it's the easiest one to read and get through. He's a journalist, and so the writing is much easier to follow. It does a really good job describing kind of the breadth of the issue, rather than getting more in depth like the New Orleans books do. So this is a really good starting place. So those are my recommendations for those of you looking to learn more about disaster capitalism. I suspect this will be a topic that we start to hear more and more about as we start experiencing the full set of consequences from climate change, and as we start to see certain countries lean more towards privatization. It's definitely an interesting subject and one that I recommend anybody in emergency management reading up on. I have put the links to all of the books I have mentioned down below, so check them out.